Psycho mom never wanted me to have a girlfriend because she wants me all to herself. When people hear the phrase mama's boy, they usually picture a guy who calls his mother too often or still asks her for cooking advice. That wasn't me. I wasn't close to my mother because I wanted to be. I was close because she made sure I had no other choice. For as long as I can remember, my mom treated me less like a son and more like someone she couldn't bear to share with anyone else. At first, it seemed harmless. She insisted on driving me everywhere, even after I got my license. She demanded to know every password to my social media accounts because she claimed parents should never have secrets from their children. If I spent too much time with friends, she'd suddenly become sick and ask me to come home immediately. I thought that was just how protective parents behaved. It wasn't until high school that I realized something was seriously wrong. Every time I became friends with a girl, my mother found a reason to make her disappear from my life. One girl supposedly came from a bad family. Another was only using me. Another was too immature. My mom always had evidence. Screenshots. Rumors. Stories she'd heard from other parents. At the time, I believed her. Looking back, I realized none of it was ever true. The first girl I actually dated lasted exactly 3 weeks. One afternoon she texted me out of nowhere, saying we needed to break up. She refused to explain why. Months later, I discovered the real reason. My mother had secretly contacted her through Facebook. She told my girlfriend that I suffered from severe anger issues, had been violent before, and needed professional help. None of it was true. She even warned the poor girl that staying with me could be dangerous. Naturally, she ran. When I confronted my mom after eventually learning what she'd done, she smiled calmly and said she had simply protected me from the wrong person. Then she hugged me and said, "One day you'll understand." I wanted to believe it had been a one-time mistake. It wasn't. The same thing happened in college. Only this time, my mother became more creative. Whenever I started seeing someone, she'd somehow discover her phone number. Sometimes she'd pretend to be another student's parent. Other times she'd anonymously send messages claiming I was cheating with multiple women. Every relationship ended before it really had a chance to begin. I couldn't understand why. Eventually, I started wondering if I was the problem. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe I attracted the wrong people. Maybe I simply wasn't meant to have a relationship. Those thoughts followed me for years. After graduation, I moved 3 hours away for work. For the first time in my life, I had some distance. My mother hated it. She called constantly. If I missed one phone call, she'd leave 5 voicemails asking whether I was dead. If I didn't answer within an hour, she'd call my coworkers. Once, she even contacted my apartment manager because I hadn't replied to her texts all afternoon. I worked in finance. I was 26 years old, yet somehow my mother still expected to know where I was every minute of every day. Then I met Sophie. Unlike anyone I'd dated before, she wasn't easily intimidated. She was confident, funny, and somehow managed to make even the worst workdays feel lighter. For months, I told almost no one we were dating. Especially not my mother. I knew exactly what would happen if she found out. So we kept things quiet. At least, we thought we did. One Saturday afternoon, Sophie invited me to her apartment for dinner. Halfway through the meal, someone started pounding on the front door. Not knocking. Pounding. Sophie looked at me, confused. She wasn't expecting anyone. Neither was I. When she opened the door, my mother was standing there, holding a homemade casserole, smiling, like she'd been invited. That's when I realized she hadn't accidentally found us. She had been following me. For a few seconds, nobody said a word. Sophie looked from my mother to me, waiting for someone to explain what was happening. I couldn't. I had no idea how my mother even knew where we were. She acted as though everything was perfectly normal. She walked into the apartment without being invited, set the casserole on the kitchen counter, and started complimenting Sophie's decorating. Then she turned to me with a smile and said she figured I'd forgotten to tell her about my dinner plans. My stomach dropped. I had never mentioned Sophie's address. Not once. After an awkward 10 minutes, Sophie politely suggested that we had already eaten. Most people would have taken the hint. My mother didn't. She pulled out 3 plates and insisted we all have dessert together. The entire evening felt surreal. She answered questions that were directed at me. She interrupted every conversation. Whenever Sophie complimented something about me, my mother immediately added a story about raising me, almost as if she needed to remind everyone who I belonged to. Eventually she left. The moment the front door closed, Sophie asked the question I had been avoiding for years. Has she always been like this? For the first time in my life, I answered honestly, yes. Instead of laughing it off or making excuses, I told Sophie everything. The fake messages, the ruined relationships, the endless phone calls, the guilt, the manipulation, the constant feeling that I wasn't allowed to have a life that didn't include my mother. She listened quietly. Then she asked one simple question. How did she know where I live? I didn't have an answer. The next morning, I checked my phone. My location sharing was turned on. Not through an app I had installed recently. Through the family account my mother had created years earlier when I was still in college. I had completely forgotten it existed. She had been able to see where I was almost every day. I turned it off immediately. Less than 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Mom. I ignored it. She called again. Then again. By lunchtime she had left 7 voicemails. The last one sounded panicked. She kept asking why my location had disappeared. She said she thought my phone had been stolen. I didn't respond. That evening, she drove 3 hours to my apartment. I knew because my security camera notified me. She knocked for nearly 15 minutes before finally leaving. The next day she sent a long text saying she couldn't sleep because she didn't know where I was. She wrote that mother's worry. She wrote that I was all she had. She wrote that she couldn't lose me. For years, messages like that would have filled me with guilt. This time, they made me uneasy. Sophie suggested I speak with a therapist. At first, I resisted. I wasn't depressed. I wasn't anxious. At least, that's what I told myself. But after a few sessions, the therapist said something that completely changed my perspective. She explained that healthy parents prepare their children for independence. They don't punish it. She pointed out that my mother wasn't encouraging a relationship. She was demanding emotional dependence. That distinction hit me hard. For the first time, I realized I had spent my entire adult life managing my mother's emotions instead of my own. The therapist challenged me to set one small boundary. Just one, so I did. I called my mother and calmly explained that I would no longer be sharing my location. I also told her she couldn't visit my apartment without asking first. There was a long silence. Then she started crying, not quietly. Loud, dramatic sobs. She accused me of abandoning her. She asked whether Sophie had turned me against my own family. She said no woman would ever love me the way my mother did. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. By the end, she hung up on me. The next week, she mailed me a package. Inside was every childhood photo she had ever framed. Every birthday picture. Every school portrait. Every family vacation. There was also a handwritten note. It said if I wanted to pretend I no longer had a mother, then she no longer needed reminders that she had a son. I stared at that box for a long time. A year earlier, I would have driven straight to her house to apologize. Instead, I quietly put the photos back into the box and carried on with my week. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to her emotions. I was protecting my own peace. I didn't realize it then. But that was exactly when she became truly desperate. For about 2 weeks, everything was quiet. No surprise visits, no dozens of missed calls, no emotional messages. Part of me wondered if my mother had finally accepted the boundaries. I should have known better. One Monday morning, my manager asked if we could talk privately. The moment I walked into his office, I noticed an older woman sitting in one of the chairs. It was my mother. She stood up the second she saw me. She smiled as if this were some perfectly normal family visit. My manager looked uncomfortable. He explained that she had arrived claiming there was a family emergency and refused to leave until she saw me. I immediately apologized to him and asked my mother to come outside. The second we reached the parking lot, her entire expression changed. She burst into tears. She said she hadn't heard my voice in nearly 3 weeks. She insisted she thought I might be dead. I reminded her that she had chosen not to answer my last text. She ignored that completely. Instead, she started asking questions. Was I still dating Sophie? Was Sophie sleeping at my apartment? Did I really plan on choosing some random girl over my own mother? People walking through the parking lot kept glancing at us. I quietly asked her to lower her voice. She only became louder. Finally, I told her she needed to leave. She stared at me like I had slapped her. Then she whispered something I'll never forget. If you marry her, you'll never need me again. That sentence explained everything. This had never been about Sophie, or my previous girlfriends, or protecting me. It was about losing control. After she drove away, my manager called me back into his office. I expected a lecture. Instead, he surprised me. He admitted his father had behaved similarly after his parents divorced. He suggested documenting every interaction from that point forward. Not because he believed my mother was dangerous, Because unhealthy behavior often escalates when it stops working. I took his advice. I saved every voicemail, every text message, every email. Within a month, the messages changed dramatically. One day she begged. The next day she blamed. Then she apologized. Then she accused Sophie of brainwashing me. The cycle repeated over and over. Meanwhile, Sophie never pressured me. She never demanded that I choose between them. She simply reminded me that healthy love doesn't require fear. 6 months later, I proposed. She said yes. It should have been one of the happiest days of my life. Instead, I spent the entire evening wondering how my mother would react. I found out sooner than expected. Someone had posted our engagement photo on social media. By midnight, my mother had left 23 missed calls. The next morning, she showed up outside my apartment with 2 large trash bags. Inside them were every birthday gift, Christmas present, and handmade card she had ever given me. She dumped everything onto the sidewalk. Then she shouted that if I was replacing her with another woman, I could give back everything she had ever done for me. Neighbors began watching from their balconies. Sophie reached for my hand. I squeezed it tightly but didn't let go. For the first time in my life, I didn't chase after my mother. I didn't apologize. I didn't beg her to stay. I simply watched as she drove away. That evening, my therapist asked me a question. If a friend told you this story, what advice would you give him? The answer came almost instantly. I'd tell him this wasn't love. It was control disguised as love. For some reason, it was much easier to recognize that truth for someone else than for myself. A month later, Sophie and I started planning our wedding. We agreed on one difficult decision. My mother wouldn't be invited unless she accepted our boundaries and genuinely changed her behavior. It wasn't meant to punish her. It was meant to protect the life we were trying to build. When she found out, she made one final move that neither of us saw coming. And it nearly destroyed everything. When my mother realized she wasn't invited to the wedding, she didn't yell. She didn't threaten me. Instead, she launched what the therapist later called an apology campaign. She sent flowers. She mailed handwritten letters. She left calm, emotional voicemails saying she finally understood that she had pushed me too far. For a moment, I believed her. Against Sophie's better judgment, I agreed to meet my mother for coffee. She looked different. Older. Tired. She cried as she apologized for interfering in my relationships. She admitted she had been terrified of ending up alone after my father died years earlier. She said I had become her entire world. I felt sorry for her. But feeling sorry for someone doesn't erase what they've done. I told her I was willing to rebuild our relationship slowly, but only if she respected 2 simple boundaries. She couldn't interfere with my relationship. And she couldn't show up unannounced anymore. She agreed immediately. For several months, everything seemed normal. She called occasionally. She asked how Sophie was. She even sent us a wedding gift with a thoughtful card. I started thinking that maybe people really could change. Then our wedding day arrived. As Sophie and I stood at the altar, I looked around the room. My mother wasn't there. Part of me felt relieved. Another part felt sad. No matter what had happened, she was still my mom. The ceremony was beautiful, simple, peaceful. Exactly what we had hoped for. Afterward, while taking photos outside the venue, one of my cousins quietly walked over and handed me his phone. He looked uncomfortable. My mother had been sitting in her car across the street for nearly 3 hours. She never came inside. She never caused a scene. She simply watched from a distance before quietly driving away. When I heard that, I felt every emotion at once. Anger. Relief. Pity. Grief. Not because she'd missed the wedding. Because I realized she still couldn't let go. A few weeks later, she asked if we could meet one last time. This time, Sophie came with me. We met at a small cafe halfway between our homes. My mother looked at both of us and said something I never expected. I spent years trying to make sure no woman would ever take my son away. She paused for a long moment. In the end, I was the one who pushed him away. No excuses followed. No blaming Sophie. No blaming loneliness. Just the truth. She had already started seeing a therapist on her own. Not because I demanded it, because she finally admitted she needed help. Recovery wasn't immediate. Some old habits returned from time to time. But when they did, she apologized instead of pretending nothing had happened. Little by little, trust began growing where fear used to live. Today, Sophie and I have a little girl. The first time my mother held her granddaughter, she cried. Not because she believed the baby belonged to her, because she understood that being a grandmother was a privilege, not a right. She has never once questioned our parenting. She never drops by without calling. She never tries to come between us. Our relationship will never look like everyone else's. Some scars don't disappear, but scars don't have to keep bleeding forever. Looking back, I no longer describe my mother as psycho. She wasn't a villain from a movie. She was a deeply lonely woman who confused love with possession and protection with control. Understanding that doesn't excuse the years she stole from me, but it does explain them. If someone reading this feels trapped by a parent who demands your entire life, remember this. A parent's job is to prepare you to live without them, not make you afraid to live without them. Real love celebrates your independence. It doesn't punish it. The moment I stopped trying to be the son my mother wanted me to stay, I finally became the man I was supposed to be. And that was the moment I gained not only a wife, but, eventually, a healthier relationship with my mother as well. Thanks for reading.